Welcome to another episode of A Tad Better Podcast, a podcast where we talk about things that can hopefully make things a tad better. Today's episode, I want to talk about creativity and vulnerability and the fact that you cannot have creativity without embracing vulnerability and the challenges that surround that. But before I get into that, I just want to take a moment to recognize the fact that I am recording this on September 11th, and I just want to pause and recognize the 3,000 lives that were lost 21 years ago today and the impact that must have had on their families and the generations after those and really our country as a whole. On a separate kind of sad note, I lost somebody that was a key figure in my life today too. So forgive me if I'm not quite as energetic as I normally am. I know I'm normally a fountain of bubbly energy. I joke, but obviously it is a sad day and I don't want to lose sight of that fact. So as I mentioned, this podcast is about things that can make things better. But the first couple episodes and the journey started with the idea that I wanted to get better at podcasting in general and the subject surrounding that so I could help some clients that had some procrastination or some hesitancy about starting podcasts. So with that said, and you can check out the other two episodes. Since this week and last week, I have learned that I had an issue with getting these podcasts to reach Apple Podcasts, and I have since figured out why that was. So if you're curious, if you have any issues with that, please let me know. The cheap microphone that I'm using actually was a hit, and I think it actually sounded better than the professional microphones I had used before that. And then the other kind of simple little thing I've learned since then is I used speaking notes last week, and I thought they went really well. But you could see the reflection of the screen in my glasses. So since then, I have changed my background to black and the letters to white, so it doesn't look as obvious on my glasses. So if you have that, that's something you can do for your speaking notes. So going back to the cheap microphone. And if you aren't, so I am keeping video again, at least for this episode, because it kind of occurred to me, and I use this thing all the time, better to have it, not need it, than to need it and not have it. So I am going to do video again for this episode, and I probably will put it on YouTube again. And I really did that last week because I wanted to show it was easier. It was easier than a lot of people say it is, and it proved to be as easy as I thought it was. So I'm keeping video again, and for those that are not watching this on video, I've already done air quotes several times, and I will try to, if anything is visual in its delivery of the message, I will try to make sure that I say that. But going back to the cheap microphone thing. One, it was a big hit, and two, it actually sounded better than I thought the professional microphone I used in week one, or in the first episode, did. And I also bring that up because, it's weird, and this goes a little bit into what we're talking about today about vulnerability and opening yourself up to criticism and the challenges that becomes. So criticism I have often got when I put my stuff out there is the quality of my audio. So I guess I bring that up. I bring that up because, one, it took relatively cheap equipment to make the audio sound good. I will also point out that the professional podcast, include one I listened to today that had Brene Brown, and we're going to talk a lot about Brene Brown, the audio in it is what I would call horrible. That one, they produced this on a national level with Brene Brown, and audio was not their big concern. So don't let that stop you. And when people come for you to talk about those things, don't let that get in your way. And try to remember what your goal is. And I've talked about that in a previous podcast. Is your goal to have a podcast that has the best audio, or is your goal to get your message out? So I probably beat that subject to death. But again, don't let criticism or the lack of professional, air quotes again, equipment stop you. I already mentioned that I'm going to refer a lot to Brene Brown. I'm a huge fan of her work, and I'm currently listening to The Power of Vulnerability by her, so she's very in my head. But I've always been a big fan of her. And she started me on a journey years ago with self-improvement in this area of creativity and vulnerability. So I will refer a lot to her work as we go forward. When I first started out trying to do a tad creative production, and again, I used air quotes because when I first started off, it was just really, I wouldn't even call it a side hustle. It was just something I was doing to bring my own creativity to life. And I kind of understand why now after years of talking about vulnerability and creativity. But when I first used that, I first started doing a tad creative stuff, being a tad creative. I used to use the slogan that everybody can be a tad creative. Oh, very clever, I thought. Because it drove me crazy when people were like, I'm not creative. Everybody is creative. And what I originally thought is I could bring out their creativity or help them be creative. And I still think that's what have a place in that, but I want to almost refresh that message and the fact that everyone is a tad creative already. And as humans, we are inherently creative, and it's literally, there's reports that'll show that we are biologically speaking, because to solve problems, especially early in our existence, to solve problems we had to be creative. That's how we survive. That's how we evolved. So we're actually innately creative. I think a lot of the problem is that creativity is defined as binary. You either are or you are not, and it's not as simple as that. And we also have narrowed down creativity into very specific forms. You're a painter, you're a writer, you're a photographer, and we see those fields as creative, and you're either good or not good at those. And again, that goes back to criticism and who's deciding what's good and not good. It actually reminds me, I follow an account on TikTok that the guy uses spray painting or graffiti. And I can think of a number of people still that wouldn't consider graffiti art or being creative, and it absolutely is, his work especially, but that is a form of creativity. Baking, knitting, all that is creativity, and we've let people kind of push us down into what, if you do these fields, then you're creative, and you only should do those if you're, quote unquote, air quotes again, good at those by other people's standards, and that drives me crazy, and that's what I think I can help overcome, is that expressing your creativity is different is important, and it's very different comparatively speaking, and we let other people get in our head. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. There's a saying I love, and this goes back to creativity and vulnerability. There's a saying I love, is you have to dare to suck at something, and that I haven't really defined vulnerability yet, or even probably really talked about the link between those two. You cannot be creative without embracing vulnerability. To put anything out in the world invites criticism, invites that you might get your feelings hurt, or that someone's going to come for you, or someone's going to say something bad about that. So you can't be creative if you're not willing to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is extremely tough for us. Again, that's why Brené Brown is as loved as she is and as famous as she studies this. And it literally takes a doctorate degree to unravel this. So you have to embrace vulnerability to be creative. And I think that's a lot of the problems people have, is why they wouldn't consider themselves creative, because they're not willing to be vulnerable, or they haven't learned to be vulnerable yet. Brené Brown definition of vulnerability, by the way, is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And I think putting out any sort of creative work will certainly expose you to uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. The studies show, actually, that if you think about it, kids are inherently creative. They draw, they do things, they dance, they sing without any sort of worry about what others are thinking and their judgment on that. But it's somewhere along the way, and I think Brené Brown talks about that 80% of the people she studied could pinpoint their squashed creativity back to kind of a traumatic event where somebody hurt their feelings, someone put them down, someone squished their creativity. And most people can think about that one moment that they were told they weren't good, or they weren't good enough, and they should stop trying to do that thing that they were trying to do. So they bury it away, and they stop being creative, and it becomes a norm for our society, especially for adults in our society. It's important to realize, and studies show this, and Brené Brown talks about it as well, that unused creativity is not benign. It's not like if you don't use your creativity, nothing bad will happen. Actually, I think it's her that said, unused creativity isn't benign. It lives within us until it's expressed, neglected to death, or suffocated by resentment and fear. It metastasizes. It turns into grief, rage, judgment, sorrow, and shame. And that is by Brené Brown. So it's really for your mental health that you have to find a way to be creative. I'm currently, what I'm listening to, she's talking about those who live in what she defines as wholeheartedness, and creativity, and the expression of creativity is fundamental to living wholeheartedly in good mental health and all the benefits that come with that. You are creative, and it's not whether you should or shouldn't express your creativity. You should. I actually heard something today, and I think it was listening to her, is when they did a study of people that the study was based around things like a mass shooting, or I think it was based off the gentleman who unfortunately took lives by climbing the bell tower at a school years and years ago. When they did a study of that, one of the overwhelming facts that stood out with people like that is their lack of play in their early life directly led to that. For lack of a better term, homicidal behavior. So they weren't allowed to be creative. They weren't allowed to express themselves, and it manifested itself in very serious and dangerous ways. I don't want to convince anybody, and no one should try to convince anybody, that it doesn't mean that isn't going to be tough and you aren't going to be criticized and the world's going to love you. No. People are going to come for you. They're going to insult you. They're going to criticize you. And ironically, the better you are at what you do, the more you are criticized, the more public you are, so you have to find a way to be okay with that criticism. And that is not easy. I don't want to be like, you have to be okay. No, that sucks. And people like myself and like Brene Brown, and not that we're comparative, still, she studies this for a living. And we'll still talk about the fact that she has to actively deal with not trying to let that criticism get in her head. One of the things that she talks about having a 1-inch sheet of paper, but I originally heard this concept with Chase Jarvis, and he talks about keeping a small piece of paper in your wallet or wherever you carry stuff like that, of a list with 5 people's names on it that you care about those opinions. And there's a way to cultivate who you should care about your opinions, but for the sake of time, you should have a list of 5 people in your wallet that you care about their opinion. And when you get criticism from somebody, ask yourself, are those people on your list? And if they're not, probably shouldn't care about their criticism. I think it's really important that you don't, and I've seen this all too many times, you don't overcompensate for that lack of caring of what people think. I see so many people harden up with that. I'm not going to care about what anybody thinks, and screw the world, blah, blah, blah. And you can't be creative without being wholehearted, and you can't be wholehearted if you've hardened up to the point that you're not letting anything get in. To be creative, to be expressive, it's a flow, and you have to allow things into your life to be able to have them manifest back out, if you will. And that's a very clumsy point, but I think it's really important that you don't overcompensate with how you feel about people's opinions, and it's not that you don't, screw the world, I'm going to do whatever I want kind of thing. There's a quote that I've used to a lot of people, and I've been using this quote probably for 2 or 3 decades now, and it's by C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to read it directly off of this. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around your hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up in a safe casket or coffin of selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. I love that quote, and I've dealt with a lot of people that have gone, I'm going to protect myself. And so make no mistakes that when you love something, and I think you have to love your creativity, and I think that's where creativity comes from, is a sense of love and expression, you're going to get hurt. But I think the question is how well you deal with that hurt. You will be criticized. I think it's how you react to that criticism, how you respond to that pain and discomfort. I think it was Brene Brown again. Can you tell I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, who said, he or she who has the greatest capacity for discomfort will rise the fastest and the strongest. So like I said, people are going to come from you, and it's what you do with that. And there are techniques for dealing with criticism, and that's probably a whole separate podcast, but it's definitely something that, one, you should practice the mental health and the practices surrounding dealing with criticism, but you should also be fully aware that they're coming, and you have to deal with that, because I think it's safe to say you have to be creative. So there's another saying that I love, and I think it's important when you think about criticism and those that are going to come for you, is that, and this is a quote by Theodore Roosevelt, and it's a long one, and it's kind of full of fancy word, so I'm probably going to stumble over it. But again, I'm going to read it directly. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out the strong man's stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does not actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails with while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who never know victory nor defeat. And I really stumbled all over that, so I apologize. I think it was Brene Brown who said, again, big fanboy, if you're not in the arena getting your ass kicked with me, I don't want to hear what you got to say about it. And there are plenty of cheap seats, and people will come for you from the cheap seats. Going back to people who criticize and where criticism comes from, Psychology Today had a big article, and I think they listed like 20 reasons people criticize. And some of them were, due to trauma and mental health and things like that. But I'm going to focus on the ones that I think the majority of criticism comes from in our creative lives and in our professional lives. And so some of the reasons they had was people that they have a strong unmet need that is not being satisfied. These are reasons people criticize you. They have a controlling personality and have to be in charge. They feel entitled to special treatment or status and do not feel that they are receiving it. They want to make you look bad so as to advance their own position or curry favor with the bosses, etc. They feel insecure and are overcompensating. And there's two more, but before I do that, I've often said that, I heard it in one of my psychology courses in college, that there's an idea that a lot of times when people come for your ideas and criticize your ideas, that it's this bias or this reality in the fact that if I believe something and you believe something and we disagree, and if you're right, then that means I'm wrong. So I have to prove you're wrong. And I think that goes back to a lot of the internet stuff we're seeing. And I think these other two reasons fit in well with that. They think you are making them look bad in front of others. So that's why people criticize. And they feel criticized by you and are counterattacking. So your position in life can make them feel threatened. Your ability to be creative can make them feel threatened because they feel they can't. If you're good at something they wish they were doing already, they'll come for you. I think it's important, and I'm kind of jumping around, but I'm also, like I said, trying to hurry a little bit. There's a difference between vulnerability and intimacy. It's important that we share our vulnerable moments, but I think that doesn't mean you have to share your intimate moments. And that is you have to decide your definition, vulnerability versus intimacy. And I absolutely agree that you should hold on to your intimate moments. And so creativity and intimacy and vulnerability, I think it's important for you to decide those lines. And you should think a little bit about that, but also know they move all the time. That what feels intimate now may not feel intimate as you get more comfortable. And you may feel the need, you may have overshared according to your own boundaries, and now you need to pull back a little bit. And that's okay. Most things do ebb and flow. I think a lot of this stems back to how we were raised in those moments we get traumatized into not being creative anymore. Well, I think most of us are taught that creativity is for small children, and it's weak and silly and weird to be creative the older you get. We see vulnerability as a weakness. A lot of us have been taught that you can't be vulnerable, you can't be sick, you can't. And if we're vulnerable, if we're creative and therefore we're vulnerable, and if we're vulnerable, we're weak. So somehow being creative must be weak. I see it all the time that adults are afraid to play. That's stupid. It's a waste of time. I feel silly doing it. Play is extremely important, not just in your childhood, because you could end up being literally a mass shooter, but in your adult life. It's how you express creativity. It's really important to our mental health, and there are plenty of studies that show that. And I know I hurried through this, but again, I'm trying to make it a little quicker than before, and I'm not sure it made a lot of sense. So maybe my fourth podcast will be on how to make more sense when you're doing a podcast. But the last thing I want to share is when I was talking several people through creativity and releasing their work, so many people would say to me that, I just do it just for me. And I just, that may be true. And maybe that goes into creativity versus intimacy, but there are a lot of people that believe that art is meant to be seen. Songs are meant to be heard. Paintings are meant to be seen. Photographers are meant to be. Otherwise, it hasn't reached its full potential and its life. I kind of agree with that, but if nothing else, I will say I'm sure that most, if not all of the people in my past that have expressed that concern, it's fear, not the belief that their creativity or that their creation should be kept to themselves. I think it's the fear, the vulnerability that has stopped them from expressing it and going further with that. I think I made all my points. If I do listen to this and it's horrible because I'm a little distracted today, maybe I'll go back and won't release it tomorrow. As always, if you have questions about full potential, creativity, creative businesses, helping solve problems, or if you just want to talk more about this, I would love to hear from that. Thanks for listening, or if you're seeing this on YouTube, thanks for watching. Bye.